All right, we back in here. Back-to-back videos in quick succession, but I couldn't leave it without doing a bit of a Champions League preview, prediction video, I guess you could call it. For me personally, I'm very excited for this season's rendition of the Champions League, considering the fact that the club I support, Chelsea, are finally back in it after a couple seasons absence. A couple seasons, probably like 3 seasons at this point. In any case, we're gonna get into some of my predictions, but I first wanted to start with a question. So, if you've come across this video, what do you all think of this league format, Champions League, that we've seen? Obviously, last season was the first rendition of this new change, and for me personally, if I'm being honest, I was very dubious of how it would work last season. You know, mainly because of two reasons. One is that, well, two reasons that roll into one. I guess it just how disadvantaged the lower level teams would be in the Champions League. Because for one, it being a league format and not a group stage, it makes it, more matches and things of that nature. It makes it a lot less likely for a deep Cinderella type run from an unexpected team in the Champions League, and just for those teams as well, just not allowing them to drop down or being given an opportunity to drop down if to the Europa League if they're not at quite the level to make it into the knockout stages. So, but I think I've come around to the idea of this Champions League. I think it's really exciting. Obviously, more matches. Who can complain about that? As a spectator, obviously, it's more burden on the players having them play more matches. But as somebody who's just watching the game, I think it's been a positive change. I just wish, obviously, that they took care of the players better in terms of their workload. But that's besides the point. I think the one criticism I would have of the Champions League, well, two, in the fact that not every team doesn't play every other team. So Chelsea are not going to play every single other team in this format, even though in the standings they're being compared to every other team, if that makes sense. Obviously, that's probably not going to be possible in the near future, considering the number of matches that are already played in the league season for a lot of these teams. I just don't think it's something that's going to be realistic in the near future unless the format of European football in general and the structure of it changes to accommodate it more. So I just think that's a little bit of a weird sort of wrinkle to the format. And the other one is what I mentioned previously, the fact that I wish that those lower level teams that finish in the lower level places in the Champions League league format, it's weird to say, but in any case, I wish they were still given an opportunity to drop down to the Europa League. The reason for that is, as I said, they're more unlikely to make runs in the Champions League as a result of this format change. And so previously allowing them to drop down to the Europa League allowed them to not only get more matches of European football, which is more income for those respective teams, but it also, just as a spectator, if you're a supporter of these clubs, it allows you to continue your European journey. And they lose out on that, obviously, with this change in format. Now, in the Champions League, they're just kind of there almost to make up the numbers. Like a team like, I don't know, a team like Club Brugge, for example, if they don't finish in the knockout rounds of the Champions League, or they finish in the top, I can't remember how many it is. Maybe it's top 24, I believe. Yeah, it's the top 24, which, should be realistic for a team like that. Finishing in the top 24 takes you into the first knockout round of the Champions League. But if you don't, your European journey is over. Where previously, when you finished third in your respective group, you drop down into the Europa League, and as a result, you get to play in a competition where more teams are at your level. Now, obviously, those top 5 European League teams were still favored in the Europa League, obviously, but it's not as if they're playing the creme de la creme of those top 5 leagues. And so I think that's probably the 2 changes that I would make. I think the second one is probably more possible than the first one, if I had to say. I don't think every team playing every other team is possible in the near future with the structure and the amount of games that are played in European football as it is. But I do think a little bit of a format change for the Europa League and the teams that don't finish in those knockout places in the Champions League will, I think that's probably a more realistic option if I had to guess. In any case, we're going to move on to my prediction on where teams finish. We're going to start with the group stage, and I'm going to give you my top 8 teams. So I think the top 2 finishers, I think in this season's group stage of the Champions League, I think it'll be Bayern as the first place team and PSG second. The reason I group those 2 teams together is just because, especially for PSG, who are already multiple points clear, I think these 2 teams will probably have comfortable enough leads in their domestic league for them to focus on the Champions League and finishing as high as possible. So that way they can get, ideally, the more favorable matchup in the knockout rounds. So I think Bayern finished 1 and PSG finished second. If I had to pick a third, 4th, and 5th, I would probably go. They got Arsenal are probably going to finish 3rd, Barcelona 4th. Just because they're still both really good teams. I just think they'll be in more of a competition in their domestic league, obviously, as I said previously. And then 5th and 6th, if I had to say, I would probably go with Liverpool in 5th, Napoli in 6th, Madrid 7, and then I have to pick a surprise team to finish in 8th, a little bit of surprise team. And if I had to pick just one, I'm going to go with Monaco. In all honesty, not sure why. That's just what I've decided to go with. Now, if I had to choose one surprise team to completely miss out on the knockout rounds altogether, I'm going to go with Leverkusen, if only because they've already sacked their manager. For one, Erik ten Hag, after 2 matches, was deemed just not fit to continue, wasn't the right fit for the job, which is hilarious in of itself. And 2, while I do think they have a good level of talent, they've had a lot of turnover in terms of their squad. They lost Frimpong, they've lost Boniface, their striker. Florian Wirtz moved on, he went to Liverpool, and so on and so forth. I know I'm missing more than a few players. And so, on top of all of that, their manager, obviously, the Real Madrid manager now. And so, who knows how they'll fare from here. But I just think the circumstances in which they've started this season doesn't bode well for their European journey. Moving forward, by the way, I'm doing this all just off the top of my head. Made a decision to record this video in the last minute, so we're gonna just like I said, off the top of the head, I'm gonna predict my semifinals and the Champions League final. Now, for the semifinal, on one side, I'm gonna go Madrid and Arsenal, and on the other side, I'm going to go Bayern Munich and Liverpool. Now, a note there. I don't have PSG in the semifinal. the reason for that, I just think for me personally, the rule that I'm making is that I cannot predict a repeat winner, so I have to choose them to lose at some point. So I think at some point before the semifinal, they get upset. Not because I don't think they're one of the best teams in Europe. I just think from season to season, you never know in the Champions League. And so as a result, I think they probably lose in the quarterfinal to, if I had to say, I would probably Bayern Munich. You know, other than Chelsea in the Club World Cup, Bayern Munich gave them their toughest match. And so I just think they're able to get the job done in Europe this season. And the other note that I have is that I support Chelsea, and having Arsenal finish in a better place in the Champions League is kind of like it's almost like treason, I guess. I don't know the right word for it. The reason that I don't have Chelsea in the semifinal or the final of this season's Champions League, I just think it's a return after a few seasons out to just make that prediction off the jump is, I think, a little bit too far. And they're still a really young team who I think will struggle to find the consistency from match to match throughout the season. And I think the counterpoint to that is that while, you know, they won the Club World Cup, they handedly beat PSG. It wasn't even close. But, you know, I think the difference is being in this Champions League as opposed to the Club World Cup is that Club World Cup was basically like one match a week, one match every 4 or 5 days, whatever it was. It was strictly tournament football, almost like the you see in the international tournaments with the nations, with the Euros and the World Cup and so on and so forth. And so as a result, that is the only competition that they're focused on. And the fitness levels will all maintain. And so you're always at your best theoretically. I know that they had just come off a long season, but so had PSG, to be fair. And so I just think on the balance of things, that's where the difference will be. And then the other thing is the intensity that you have from match to match, playing 2 games a week in the Champions League as well as the league. It's just a higher level of intensity. And considering the fact that to this point, Chelsea already have 2 long-term injuries with Liam Delap and Dario Sugo. And then Levi Colwill, already being rolled out for most, if not all, of the season. I just think it's probably a season too early in the way that it is a season too early for them in the Premier League as well. And that's my reasoning behind it. I hope I am proven wrong, and I hope they do win the whole thing, obviously. And I will probably predict them when it comes down to it to beat every team that they come up with if they're fortunate enough to make the knockout phase. But that's why I'm making this prediction video now, so that I can hold myself accountable to that prediction while also being delusional later on in the season. In any case, back to the semifinals. I have Real Madrid and Arsenal on one side, and I think Real Madrid get their get back, they get their revenge, and they make the final. If for no other reason than out of spite, and that I think it would be funny. Now, the other semifinal, I had Bayern Munich and Liverpool, and I'm going to say that Bayern Munich make the final. And in the final, this is something you should never do, and I'm going to do it anyway. But I'm going to say that Bayern Munich win the Champions League, and they defeat Real Madrid in the final. Now, this is crazy to say, obviously, because Real Madrid are the kings of the Champions League. They don't lose in finals when they get there. That's just the history of their club. But I think this is the season where we see something crazy like that. And I think Bayern Munich, I think with their additions, they're a little thin, obviously, with their squad. But I think come mid-season, especially if, as I predicted, they are kind of running away with the league, maybe they can rotate more in that competition. And as a result, find themselves in a position to round into shape come the knockout rounds. And, hopefully Jamal Musiala, who suffered a major injury over the summer, I read somewhere that he's probably out till after the new year, closer to the spring. Hopefully by then he is back healthy. Who knows? The addition of Nico Jackson, while I think it would be hilarious, for one, that he would win the Champions League with Bayern Munich while still technically being a Chelsea player, I think he provides them with very good cover. And he's a very good player in general. And so, yeah, as a result, Bayern Munich win the Champions League. It's been a while since a German team has won it, obviously, considering the last team to win it was them. And I think I think it'd just be interesting to see a team other than an English team or a Spanish team win the Champions League. Now, I think the biggest threat probably to that prediction, if I had to guess, other than PSG, as I said, because my role for this video is that PSG, I cannot predict them to win the Champions League. It just wouldn't be interesting to do so. I think the biggest threat to that is probably Barcelona. I have them repeating it in the league over Real Madrid. I just don't think Real Madrid will gain the consistency enough and the balance in time enough to keep pace in the same way with Barcelona. And Barcelona has had Real Madrid number in the Clásicos the past few seasons. Like, it hasn't even been close. Anyway, in terms of Barcelona, I think being the biggest threat to spoiling my prediction, it just seems to me that cohesion wise and the level of talent that they have, they're just a really, really good team. Lamine Yamal, I think, probably takes a step up and maybe has a shout for player of the tournament, and then maybe finishes in the top 3 of the Ballon d'Or. And so I think their biggest weakness to me is I think their biggest weakness to me is probably just whether Lewandowski can stay healthy and maintain the level that is needed to be their main number 9 throughout the full season. They have Rashford, obviously, Ferran Torres, the Shark, as well, who can deputize in that position. I think Rafinha can do a job. But I just think in order for them to spoil the party in terms of my prediction, I just think Lewandowski has to stay healthy. Same with, a lot of their major players. Gavi, I think, is out with a long-term injury again. We'll see about Balde, who I think is their best option at left back, of course. And so, they're probably a little weak, a little thin in terms of depth at center back if something happens to Araujo and Pau Cubarsí. And Araujo himself isn't the best fit in the system with how high of a line they play. Like, they play a suicidal high line in the same way that Ange did with Spurs. Just Barcelona do it better because they're just a better team in general. But yeah, in any case, Bayern Munich are my Champions League winners, and that's all I have for today. If you've come across this video, I appreciate you watching, and I will see you for the next one.